Okay, so picture this, right? It's Sunday morning, and you wake up. You're totally convinced it's 8 a.m., ready to, conquer the day, grab brunch, all that. But then you glance at the clock, and bam! It's actually 9 a.m. That hour just vanished, and brunch is, well, toast. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's the magic of daylight saving time, or DST, as the cool kids call it, messing with our minds and our mornings big time. So I think
Right.
we've all been there. But why do we even bother with this whole clock-changing thing anyway? Is it really about saving energy, or are we all just sacrificing sleep for absolutely no reason? That's exactly what we're diving into today, folks. We've got congressional reports, studies galore, and even a sneak peek at what's happening with DST over in the EU.
It's actually a surprisingly global story, this whole time-bending saga. But before we go international, let's rewind a bit. Let's look at how timekeeping even became a thing in the US. It's wilder than you might think. Back in the 1800s, before time zones were standardized, every city basically ran on its own, like sun time.
Whoa, hold on. So every town had its own time.
Pretty much, yeah. Can you imagine the chaos? Trying to catch a train when every town along the way is operating on a different time.
Oh, man. That's a logistical nightmare just thinking about it.
Mm.
So how do we go from time chaos to the somewhat organized system we have today?
You can thank the railroads for that. See, they needed to coordinate schedules across vast distances. So in 1883, they pushed for standardized time zones. It was a total game changer. But then World War I happened and saving fuel became a national priority. That's where the Standard Time Act of 1918 comes in. It introduced daylight saving time as a way to, squeeze more daylight out of each day and theoretically use less energy.
Ah, the good old make the most of daylight argument. Makes sense, I guess, on the surface. But did it actually work? Were we all just stumbling around in the dark before DST came along?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer, like most things in life, is a little complicated. They ditched DST after the war. Then some states brought it back on our own. And it wasn't until the Uniform Time Act of 1966 that we got the more standardized system we have today, although even that's had its fair share of tweaks and adjustments over the years. But here's where things get interesting. Europe actually adopted DST before the U.S. during World War I, but now they're actually considering scrapping the whole thing.
No way. So no more springing forward or falling back in years. That's a bold move. What's the thinking there? Are they just tired of resetting their clocks, or is there something more to it?
Well, the proposal would let each member state decide whether to stick with permanent standard time or permanent summer time. So it'd be like a continent-wide experiment in time management.
That's pretty wild. So we've got this global time change tango happening.
Oh.
But let's get down to brass tacks. Why is there so much back and forth about DST in the first place? What are the big pros and cons that keep this debate going?
It boils down to the perceived benefits and drawbacks, which, as you can imagine, really depend on who you ask. People who are pro-DST often talk about the economic benefits, like, increased tourism and retail sales because of the extended daylight hours.
Yeah. Who doesn't love an extra hour of daylight for hitting the shops or grabbing dinner on a patio, right?
Exactly. But the folks who are anti-DST have some pretty strong points, too.
I'd imagine so. What are some of their biggest concerns?
One of the biggest is kids' safety, especially when it comes to those early morning commutes to school in the dark. Not exactly ideal for visibility or peace of mind.
That's a good point. And it makes you wonder if those supposed benefits really outweigh those risks, especially when we're talking about something as important as safety. What else are people concerned about?
Another argument is the impact on industries that rely on early morning light, like golf courses or ski resorts. Think about it. If it's dark until later in the morning, it cuts into their operating hours and could really impact their bottom line.
So we've got arguments about economics, safety, even industry-specific impacts. It's like a giant time change tug of war. But honestly, are these claims even based on evidence? Or are we all just arguing about personal preference?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to shift gears and dive into the research on daylight saving time. Buckle up. It's about to get interesting.
Okay, so let's really put DST under the microscope.
Yeah.
See what the research actually says. First up, safety. Does that extra hour of daylight actually lead to fewer accidents?
Well, you'd think, right. More light, better visibility, safer roads. But it's not that straightforward. The Department of Transportation did this big study back in the 1970s. And the results were pretty inconclusive. They couldn't really say for sure whether DST had a significant impact on traffic safety one way or another.
There's no clear winner in the safety department.
Yeah.
But I thought one of the main arguments for DST was energy savings. Surely there's got to be some hard evidence for that, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you? I mean, the whole idea was to, like, reduce our reliance on artificial light, but the Department of Energy's 2008 report kind of threw a wrench in that argument. They found that extending DST, like we did back in 2005, only led to a tiny reduction in energy consumption, like a measly 0.02%.
Wait, 0.02%? That's like finding a penny on the sidewalk and, like, not even bothering to pick it up. So much for the whole energy-saving thing. What's interesting here is that studies on DST and energy seem to be all over the place. Some show savings, some show increases, and it's likely that other factors like technology and just people's behavior play a much bigger role.
Yeah, exactly. We can't just isolate DST and be like, aha, this is the answer to all our energy problems. It's way more complicated than that. But let's talk about the big one, our health. Messing with our body clocks can't be good, can it?
Right. Feels like every time we spring forward or fall back, our bodies are just like, what in the world just happened? I
Yeah.
definitely feel that, like grogginess and disorientation after the time change. So what does the research say about how DST affects our health?
Well, the news isn't great. Studies have linked those time changes to all sorts of not so fun things, like an increased risk of heart attacks, sleep disturbances, mood swings. It's not pretty. Our bodies have these internal clocks called circadian rhythms. They basically regulate our sleep-wake cycles, and when we mess with them, it can throw everything off.
So basically, our bodies are trying to stick to a schedule.
Uh-huh.
And then DST comes along and throws a wrench in the works. No wonder we feel so out of whack. What's the official word from, like, the medical community, though? Are they as worried about DST as the research seems to suggest?
They are. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine has actually come out and said, hey, you know what? Sticking with standard time year-round is probably the best thing for our health and safety. They're not beating around the bush on this one.
Wow, ditching the time change completely. They're definitely taking this seriously. But here's the thing. If the evidence is so iffy and even points to potential harm, what are people actually doing about it? Are we stuck on this DST merry-go-round forever?
Well, not necessarily. States can't just go rogue and adopt permanent DST on their own because of that Uniform Time Act we talked about. But they're definitely trying to push for change. As of 2020, a whopping 45 states had introduced some kind of legislation related to DST.
So almost every state is at least thinking about it. That's a pretty clear sign that people aren't happy with how things are. Are any states actually taking action, or is it all talk?
It's more than talk. 11 states have gone ahead and actually enacted permanent DST laws. But there's a catch. They need federal approval to make it official, so for now, it's a waiting game.
Okay, so we've got Delaware, Florida, Idaho, Louisiana, Maine, Oregon, South Carolina, Utah, Tennessee, Washington, and Wyoming all ready to soak up the sunshine year-round. That's a lot of states. And what about California? They've been making some noise about DST too, right?
Oh yeah, they have. Californians passed Proposition 7, which basically gives their legislature the power to make permanent DST happen. But they need a 2/3 majority vote, so they're like right on the edge of permanent sunshine, just waiting for that final push. And it's not just legislatures either. There's been attempts to put DST on the ballot in places like Colorado and Missouri, but those haven't really taken off yet.
It's pretty clear that this whole DST debate is far from over. What's fascinating to me is that it's not just about personal preference or convenience. It's tied up in economics, safety, health, even politics.
It really is. It's the perfect example of how something seemingly simple like changing our clocks can have these ripple effects across society. And it shows just how important it is to look at the evidence, weigh the pros and cons, and have open conversations about how we manage time as a society.
Well said. Speaking of evidence, we've got some actual legislation to look at. What do you say we dive into the nitty-gritty of one of these bills pushing for permanent DST?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's take a look behind the curtain, right? At the actual legislation trying to make permanent DST happen. We've got the Sunshine Protection Act of 2021, which, get this, actually sailed through the Senate back in March 2022.
Yeah, catchy name, right? The Sunshine Protection Act sounds so, like, optimistic and hopeful. But seriously, this bill aims to do exactly what its name suggests. Make daylight saving time permanent across the U.S. It would basically repeal that part of the Uniform Time Act that makes DST temporary.
So no more going back and forth. We just spring forward and stay sprung.
Exactly. But of course, it's not as easy as just saying DST forever. The bill gets into the specifics of, like, how standard time would be adjusted for each time zone, basically shifting everything forward by an hour.
Okay, so if I'm in Eastern Standard Time right now, I'd permanently be on what we currently call Eastern Daylight Time.
Yep, that's the gist of it.
Makes sense. But what about those states that opted out of DST? Would they be forced to join the Sunshine Party?
That's a good question. And the bill addresses that too. It says that states that have exempted themselves from DST, or even specific areas within those states, they can choose to stay on their current standard time.
So they've got the option to keep doing their own thing. It seems fair. But hold on. This bill passed the Senate back in 2022. So why are we still changing our clocks? What happened?
Ah, welcome to the world of lawmaking, right? Where things move about as fast as a snail in a traffic jam. So the Senate may have given it the thumbs up, but the bill kind of hit a wall in the House of Representatives. It never actually became law.
So it's stuck in legislative limbo. Even with all this talk about change, it's not as easy as just passing a bill and boom, permanent DST.
Not quite. There are definitely a few hurdles to clear, but the fact that it made it through the Senate and that so many states are pushing for it, it really shows that people are getting pretty fed up with the current system.
For sure. I mean, we've seen that the research on DST's benefits is, well, kind of shaky.
Yeah.
And there's a good chance it's actually messing with our health.
Exactly. And that whole energy-saving argument is pretty weak, especially with that 0.02% figure from the Department of Energy. It's pretty clear this debate is far from over, but this whole conversation makes you wonder, what happens next? Are we headed for permanent standard time? Permanent DST? Or maybe some kind of crazy patchwork system where each state does its own thing?
It's like a choose-your-own-adventure for time zones.
Yeah.
So what stood out to you the most in all this? What's the most, surprising or interesting thing you've learned about DST?
For me, it's got to be the potential health effects. We tend to just brush off DST as a minor inconvenience, right? But the research suggests it could actually be linked to some pretty serious stuff like heart attacks, mood disorders, even car accidents. It makes you think twice about whether those few extra hours of daylight are really worth the risk.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about complaining about resetting our clocks. We're talking about real health risks here. And it's not even just the immediate effects of the time changes, that disruption to our circadian rhythms, those internal clocks that regulate our sleep. That can have long-term consequences for our health and well-being.
Exactly. It's like our bodies are always playing catch up. And that takes a toll. It really shows that we need more research in this area so we can actually make informed decisions about how we manage time as a society.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. The history of DST, the debates, the research, and even the possible consequences of this whole time change thing. We've definitely uncovered more questions than answers. But hey, that's what makes a good deep dive so great, right? It's about getting you curious and making you think about the world in new ways. So here's the big question for everyone listening. If you could vote on permanent DST, how would you vote and why?
What factors would you consider? Would it be economic benefits, safety concerns, those potential health impacts? It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers.
Exactly. And think about your own life, your work, your family's needs. How would a permanent time change affect your day-to-day? What works for someone who stays up late might be a nightmare for an early riser, and vice
Okay.
versa. And what about people who work nights or have, irregular schedules?
Yeah, it's a huge puzzle with all these interconnected pieces. And let's not forget those states that are already pushing for permanent DST. What happens if they get their way while other states stick with standard time? We could end up with this crazy patchwork of time zones across the country. Can you imagine the chaos?
It would definitely make things more interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But hey, maybe that's just the price of progress, right?
Maybe so. We may not have all the answers right now. But this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. This whole DST saga is a perfect example of how something seemingly simple can have these huge ripple effects across society.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is, and how even small changes can have these big unintended consequences. We've learned that DST's benefits are definitely up for debate. And it's very possible that it's actually hurting our health. So what's the verdict? Is DST a genius idea, a necessary evil, or just a bad habit we can't seem to break?
The jury's still out on that one. But one thing's for sure, the current system isn't working for everyone. We need some thoughtful, evidence-based solutions that prioritize public health and well-being.
Absolutely. So what's next? What can our listeners do if they want to get involved in this whole DST debate?
Stay informed. See what your state legislature is up to. Maybe even reach out to your representatives and let them know how you feel about DST. Your voice matters. And you can actually help shape the future of time in America.
You got it. All right, that's a wrap for today's deep dive into the wild world of daylight saving time. We explored the history, the arguments for and against it, the research, and the potential consequences. We uncovered way more questions than answers, but that's the beauty of a good deep dive, right? It's all about sparking your curiosity and getting you to think critically about the world around you. Make sure you check out the show notes for links to all those studies and laws we talked about. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and try not to get too lost in the time zone shuffle.